this is my weekly video, and I wanted to reach out to you guys. There are a few things that we need to talk about, some announcements that I need to make, and then I want to take a few minutes to kind of recap the discussion that you guys had on Flipgrid. I didn't have a way to mass video all of you in response to that. I had to do it individually, and that just didn't seem very efficient, so we're doing it this way instead in our weekly updates. So first, I just want to make sure that you guys got the message from the district that we are extending online distance learning through April. Officially, we are slated to return to school Monday, May 4th. I don't know if that's actually going to be a thing. I hope so, because I really miss you guys, and I miss being in the classroom, and I miss going to school. But at this time, also, we are still not taking grades. I don't know if that will change in light of other districts switching to a pass-fail basis, or how that would look, or what it would mean. All of those questions are way above my pay grade, and as soon as the higher-ups make those decisions, I will pass on that information, I promise. That said, we will continue to turn in work to show that, one, we are still learning stuff, because really, learning stuff is amazing and we love it. And two, we are engaging in these learning opportunities so that the state doesn't make us go to school in June and July, because that would suck. Okay, I don't know if that would actually happen, let's be clear. These are just things that have been thrown around, rumors on Twitter. You should never listen to rumors on Twitter, you know? Now, as far as announcements from College Board about AP tests, some of you may have already seen the information or the stuff on the College Board website or on Twitter, but I wanted to give you as much information as I can right now. So according to the College Board website, your exam is an at-home, open book, open note, modified DBQ. So what that means is the question will present you with 5 historical sources. Just like with the other DBQs, they gave you 7, now it's only 5. And one of those is going to be non-text based, meaning it's going to be an image or a chart of some kind. In your response to this document-based question, you need to have a thesis, that answers all parts of the question, which is not as that's not as easy to do. You need to have your contextualization. You have to use at least 4 of 5 of the documents. So all or one less than all of the documents, just like before. You need to do Hippie or Soapstone, meaning you have to source your documents for at least 2 of those documents, whichever ones you use. And then you have to use 2 pieces of evidence beyond the documents. That's like outside information. That's where that whole open note, open book thing can really come into play. And if time, you need to provide some kind of really in-depth analysis. So you need to corroborate, qualify, or modify an argument. Any argument. It can be your argument. It can be somebody else's argument, whatever. Any argument. The problem is that you only have 45 minutes to do this. So this is where it becomes tricky negotiating your writing, your planning, and if it's open note and open book and you spend too much time digging through, then it's all of those notes and books, it becomes difficult to actually get done in 45 minutes. So you do still need to kind of study and kind of just get up on the information of units 1 through 6, which is why we will continue to practice and review that content through quizzes and stuff like that. From this point forward, however, all of the writing assignments, not including this week, because this week we're still trying to transition you into reminding you how to look at documents and using the SAQ format. And then starting next week, it's going to be a whole lot of DBQ writing from this point forward, because we really want to make sure that you are on point and ready to go for that. Anyway, so you'll have 45 minutes to type your response, and then 5 minutes to upload your response into the College Board website. More information about how that all will work and what you need to make sure that you have your computer ready to go for, that will come out soon. They said late April. I don't know what that means. The other thing you may not have realized or may not have looked, before the exam date was May 15th. Now they've postponed everything by a couple of weeks. So now your exam date is Thursday, May 21st at 1 p.m. More information is going to come out about that as well, and I'll keep you posted as things develop. Okay, so those are the major announcements. Now let's talk about the Cold War and themes evidenced in the Cuban Missile Crisis that can be found throughout the Cold War. Okay, so the first theme I'd like to talk about is the role and importance of relationships. So both sides of the Cold War, the US and the USSR, developed relationships and will use those relationships as tools to further their own goals. So think of the world like a chessboard, and the two sides are strategically placing their pieces all over the world to best protect their assets. So when the time comes, they are ready. Checkmate, right? So this can be seen through multiple examples throughout the Cold War. It can be seen by the relationship between the United States and Turkey. So the Marshall Plan, and more directly, the Truman Doctrine, established a relationship that allowed the U.S. to put nuclear missiles, Jupiter missiles, in Turkey in 1959. So just to be clear, putting these maneuvering or deploying their arsenals in other countries was important at the time because this was before the technology of ICBMs, which are intercontinental ballistic missiles, or basically nuclear missiles that have long-range capability. So it was important that the U.S. arsenal was able to be deployed in Europe. Right, so this is why that relationship with Turkey was so important, because Turkey is close to the Soviet Union, and they could point those missiles at the Soviet Union and basically threaten them, right? So in reaction, the Soviet Union began a relationship with Cuba, because Cuba is like 90 miles off of the Florida coast, right? And recently as in at this time, Cuba had overthrown the old regime and instituted a communist regime under the leadership of Fidel Castro. So at this time, Khrushchev was the premier in the Soviet Union. And the Khrushchev-Castro bromance is one for the ages. Seriously, look them up, find pictures. They are always holding hands and hugging and smiling and just like having a really demonstrative relationship of friendship, and they like each other. They really like each other. And part of that really is down to Khrushchev himself being such a charismatic, compelling person. He was this small man, but very big personality. And he just kind of like attracted people to him. But this relationship will prove important on the world stage because it served as a security for Cuba against any kind of U.S. interference, and it allowed close placement to the U.S. of nuclear missiles for the Soviet Union in answer to the U.S. missiles already in Turkey. So this theme of creating advantageous relationships is present throughout the Cold War. Some other examples: in the 1970s, the U.S. President Nixon was negotiating the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT I, with the Soviet Union. It is what it sounds like, Arms Limitation Treaty. They're trying to limit the amount of nuclear weapons that each country will produce, right? And negotiations were not going well. So Nixon, despite all of his faults, was pretty brilliant when it came to foreign policy. He decides he needs to go to China and make new friends. Now, keep in mind, China is a communist nation and has a long-standing alliance with the Soviets. So China is one of the USSR's most powerful allies. And so Nixon, he's like, I'm going to go on a trip to China. And he brings his wife and he arrives in China. He has a great time. He learns about the culture and he eats Chinese food and he learns about different Chinese history. And everyone takes a ton of photos where everyone's laughing and smiling and being very chummy. And even the wives are like hanging out, best friends, right? So, and Nixon leaves China and he has some ceremonial stuff and nothing else. No alliances, no treaties, nothing like very official or politically official or diplomatically official. Just kind of like, hey, we're buds now. And the next thing you know, suddenly the Soviets are ready to deal. And Nixon gets his way with the Arms Limitation Treaty. And relationships, this is like a key example of how relationships were tools to be used to achieve goals. And this is why you had the creation of NATO and the creation of the Warsaw Pact. So that was East versus West, right? This is why Reagan and Gorbachev will cultivate a relationship that will actually bring an end to the Cold War. Really, you need to think about it. These relationships will serve purposes that are for good things, but also for not so great things, because these relationships will facilitate the two major powers, or allow them to intervene in what are going to be known as proxy wars against each other, so that these two powers can fight each other without actually fighting each other. So that's one theme that's present throughout Cold War and present in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Second theme that you guys talked about was the intimidation factor. And it is indeed a theme prevalent throughout the Cold War. It may have even started before the Cold War. Many historians argue that Truman and the U.S. Dropping the atomic bombs on Japan to end World War II was only part of the story. Most historians agree that intimidating the Soviets played some part in the decision-making to drop the atomic bombs. The disagreement comes on how big of a part did it play. Some historians say it was the major reason why the U.S. dropped the atomic bombs on Japan, and other historians were like, no, it's like a secondary thing. It's not as big. Really, they're trying to end World War II. So that's where the disagreement comes. But it's interesting that fight even occurs, right? And it's all because intimidation is a key factor in the Cold War. So you can absolutely see how it played a role in the Cuban Missile Crisis, because essentially you've got these two sides and they are literally squaring off in the middle of the Caribbean, like, let's go, right? They bring both their navies and they've got their nuclear weapons and everyone's ready to go. And often the Cuban Missile Crisis is likened to a staring contest. He who blinks first loses, right? And most American historians will argue that the Russians or the Soviets lost because Khrushchev blinked first. But this is a little too black and white of an answer to that. We are better than that. We know it's more nuanced, it's more gray, right? So that this idea of a staring contest is too simple. And it completely overlooks the constant back and forth that is required or necessary for a 45-year Cold War to continue. So, intimidation does play a role, but it is only part of the story. Intimidation can be seen in many events, like the building of the Berlin Wall. You can see it in the shows of force by both sides throughout the world. The Soviet Union will flex its muscles in the Eastern Bloc, that geographical area that the Soviets created as a buffer zone, and in its invasion of Afghanistan later on in the Cold War. This can also be seen in the constant U.S. interference in the Caribbean and Latin America. In fact, intimidation is arguably the basis for the arms race and buildup, the space race, and even why science and math become so important in the education system of both countries. So this leads directly into another theme that you guys picked up on, and this is the idea of compromise and diplomacy. Both of these things become incredibly important throughout the Cold War. Despite the grandstanding and posturing, neither side really wanted to engage in nuclear war. At the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, more information and research came to light about the long-term effects of nuclear missiles. The long-term destruction of ecosystem, increasing rates of radiation poisoning, increasing rates of cancer, increasing rates of stillborns or stillbirths, miscarriages, and birth defects, just to name a few. Now you combine this with the growing strength and potential for damage of both sides' arsenals, and diplomatic ideas will evolve into this idea of what is called mutually assured destruction, to basically be ready if the worst occurs, right? So both countries are thinking, if I'm going down, I'm bringing you with me. So compromise and diplomacy become necessary to maintain the two-sided coin of maintaining a strong front, like powerful, war-ready country, while also creating loopholes and backdoors to maneuver away from all-out nuclear war. So this required constant communication, negotiation, and diplomacy, and the Cuban Missile Crisis was like a turning point because it was the closest the two powers got to all-out nuclear war in the entirety of the 45-year Cold War. Which brings me to the next theme that quite a few of you picked up on, and that is the importance of communication in dangerous situations presented by the Cold War. So communication came in many forms throughout the war. Sometimes it was indirect. Examples of this will be speeches made by leaders of the world, like Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, in which Churchill basically tells the U.S. after World War II that as holders of the power of nuclear technology, the U.S. cannot return to isolation as they've always done before. And then there's Reagan's Tear Down This Wall speech, in which Reagan implores Soviet leadership to remove the Berlin Wall, dividing communist and capitalist sections in Berlin. Other examples will be televised propaganda like Looney Tunes cartoons promoting anti-Soviet messages to children, and still other examples will be a public presentation. The most notable of these will be the kitchen debates, where the U.S. sets up like this model kitchen about all of these new technologies that U.S. capitalism has been able to create and innovation that they've been able to create. But they set it up in the American National Exhibition in a park in Moscow. And the idea was to show the Russian people, what they were missing by clinging to communism or adhering to communism, and that they should overthrow communism and embrace capitalism, because capitalism will get them all of these new innovations. And strangely, it became like an impromptu debate between the Soviet Premier Khrushchev and the then Vice President Richard Nixon. So, and many historians will agree that Khrushchev came out the leader or the winner of that debate. But in the long run, we actually, hindsight is 2020, and we see that capitalism did actually allow greater access to new technologies and innovations than communism did. But in addition to these passive-aggressive means of communication, direct communication between the major powers became increasingly important and happened way more often as the Cold War developed. In fact, after the near war with the Cuban Missile Crisis, both the U.S. president and the Soviet premier had access to what was called the hotline. And it literally was like a red phone in the Oval Office and in Moscow, where the premier and the president, they could just pick it up and immediately communicate between DC and Moscow. It was immediate communication, so that if there was life-threatening nuclear war about to happen, hey, did you mean to send nuclear warheads our way, or what? What's going on, right? So this was really to kind of prevent nuclear war from happening, and that communication does become super necessary. Now, after World War II, there was that creation of the UN, the United Nations, which was supposed to be like an international collective where countries had a place to air out grievances. And at first, the UN was super important right after World War II. But increasingly, it became bogged down in politics, and it became less and less helpful and less relevant to negotiating the problems between the Soviet Union and the United States. So, finally, a couple of you mentioned a theme that is more undercover, no pun intended, and that is the theme of secrecy and espionage. So, what's crazy about the Cold War is that espionage okay, back up. Espionage is not a new thing. Spies are not new. There have been spies since the beginning of political entities. It's that's a thing. But what's crazy about the Cold War is that these two governments officially created espionage agencies. So the US creates the CIA and the Soviet Union creates the KGB, and it's officially coming out and saying to the opposition, to the opposing side, that, hey, we're watching you. And you don't know when and you don't know how, but we're there. We promise. And they were. There was constant secrecy, and there was constant people finding various clues and whatever. So it's super interesting. And the goal of these agencies was to discover information, obviously, that would best help their government make better decisions on how to deal with the opposition. But another one was to create instability in the areas where the enemy was powerful, if not at home, then in other areas. And one of the best examples of that is the CIA will involve themselves in an event called the Bay of Pigs. And they will try to essentially lead a coup against Castro and overthrow Castro and reinstate the old regime in Cuba. Unfortunately, it was a huge failure because at the last second, JFK is like, nah, we're not going to do that. And so it leaves the rebels, the Cuban rebels, kind of high and dry against Castro. And what it ends up doing also strangely is it convinces the Soviets that the US and JFK are weak and they won't actually do anything. And so it gives them the confidence to start like shipping missiles into Cuba, which will eventually culminate in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay. But they aren't just trying to create instability throughout the world in various places, but these espionage agencies are also agencies to create misinformation amongst their enemies and amongst the homelands of the enemies, sowing confusion and distrust, and they can be arguably very successful. All right. I hope that this helped kind of recap the big ideas of the assignment. Thanks to all of you who created and submitted your videos. Till next time, I'll see you next week.